Psalm 81, verse 3. Judgment Day. Judge for the needy and the fatherless. Do justice to the humble and the poor. Psalm 81, verse 3. Douay Rheims. If in the previous passage, judges are warned against rendering judgment in favor of the rich and powerful because they are rich and powerful, he now turns to the other side, that they should be just towards the needy and the fatherless. As St. Bellarmine notes, this isn't a knee-jerk reaction that simply opts for the opposite, but rather expresses the intended impartiality of justice. Quote, freely entertain, diligently discuss, and, for fear they may suffer by protracted litigation, decide as quickly as possible on the case of the poor, and especially of the orphan. This, however, supposes that they have justice at their side, for, in Leviticus 19, we read, respect not the person of the poor, nor honor the countenance of the mighty, but judge thy neighbor according to justice. The meaning, then, is not to judge at all times in favor of the poor, but, when he shall have justice at his side, that the judge shall take care to make it appear, and not to allow him to be oppressed by the influence of his adversaries. St. Robert Bellarmine, A Commentary on the Book of the Psalms, 81:3. In the ancient world, land tended to be passed down through the succeeding generations of a family, and this holding was a large portion of a family's wealth and sustenance. Someone who is fatherless would have potentially been seen as having less claim to his land, as the provenance and the form of the lineage would have been weakened. The lack of extended family structure would also make such a person more isolated, and thus more liable to the machinations of the rich who might seek to appropriate his land for themselves. In 1 Kings, we see the story of Naboth's vineyard, in which the evil king Ahab wishes to obtain Naboth's vineyard to use as a garden, and begins with offering to purchase it from him for either a better vineyard or money. Naboth refuses, citing his possession of it in continuity with his ancestors. King Ahab, wicked though he is, still feels bound by the law and begins sulking, perhaps subtly hoping to catch the eye of his even more evil wife Jezebel. She sees him pouting and inquires as to why he is acting so, and then mocks him for refusing to act as all kings act and just taking it for himself. He then allows her to take matters into her own hands, likely knowing full well the extent of her depravity and ruthlessness. She devises a trap for Naboth, proclaiming a fast and having Naboth set as chief among the people, but then paying 2 sons of Belial to accuse him of blasphemy and sedition, at which point he is carried out and stoned to death. The narrative concludes, and it came to pass when Jezebel heard that Naboth was stoned and dead, that she said to Ahab, arise and take possession of the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite, who would not agree with thee and give it thee for money. For Naboth is not alive, but dead. And when Ahab heard this, to wit, that Naboth was dead, he arose and went down to the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite to take possession of it. 1 Kings chapter 21, verses 15 through 16, Douay Rheims. We can see just how much of a simp King Ahab was, for he doesn't ask how Naboth is suddenly dead, although he probably knows, given his wife's ruthlessness, but that doesn't stop him from immediately going and taking possession of the vineyard so he can have his garden. Had Naboth any descendants, they would have had to have been killed as well, which indicates that he likely didn't, which is why he was in such a vulnerable state. On the other hand, the charges of blasphemy and sedition against Naboth may have been not only to expedite the execution, but also to delegitimize any claims by other kin upon the vineyard. Ultimately, what stood between Ahab and the vineyard was this annoyingly principled man Naboth, and Jezebel made sure that he was dealt with. These infractions of justice by the powerful against the weak are the source of many ills throughout the history of God's people in the Scriptures, and indeed throughout all of human history. To pervert justice in favor of the powerful because they are powerful is to blaspheme on some level, as such perversions of justice call into question the one who is justice itself. However, as St. Bellarmine noted, it is not simply the verdict itself which can be unjust, but even the process when he speaks of suffering by means of protracted litigation. In modern parlance, we call this phenomenon by the phrase, the process is the punishment. Litigation always takes a lot of time and money, and thus can be tilted in favor of the one who has more resources at his disposal. Cases that drag out for years can ultimately ruin someone, even if in the end the judgment is in their favor. The psalmist thus implies that to do justice to the humble and the poor is to render a judgment expediently that is not influenced by the status of the person or his wealth, but rather by the merits of the case. The sad reality of this vale of tears is that the wealthy and powerful are often in such positions because of a lack of scruples in how they obtain such things, and thus the just judge must not be swayed by riches or status or power or any other such things, lest the humble and poor be brought even lower by the machinations of the powerful. St. Augustine ties this into the incarnation of our Lord, who for our sake, even though he was rich, nevertheless became poor by dwelling among us. Quote, "Was he not willing for your sake to become, as it were, a child under guardians? Did he not for your sake hunger and thirst like one in need? Did he not cry to you, 'Learn of me, for I am meek and lowly of heart'? Did he not become poor when he was rich, that by his poverty we might be made rich? Give sentence, therefore, for the fatherless and the poor man. Justify the humble and needy. Not them who for their own sake are rich and proud, but him who for your sake was humble and poor. Believe ye to be righteous, proclaim him righteous." St. Augustine, Expositions on the Psalms, 81:3. Thus, the dignity of the person and his claim to justice cannot be predicated on his status or wealth, for the infinite dignity of our Lord and his perfect innocence were clothed in poverty and humility. We are called to imitate this humility, both by being poor in spirit and in humbling ourselves before God, not thinking of ourselves more highly than we ought. In humility we join ourselves to our Lord, and in baptism have the charity of God poured into our souls, by which the righteousness of God is infused into our souls. This is what gives us confidence on the day of judgment, when we all will be judged justly. Quote, "And we have known and have believed the charity which God hath to us. God is charity, and he that abideth in charity abideth in God, and God in him. In this is the charity of God perfected with us, that we may have confidence in the day of judgment, because as he is, we also are in this world. Fear is not in charity, but perfect charity casteth out fear, because fear hath pain. And he that feareth is not perfected in charity. Let us therefore love God, because God first hath loved us." 1 John chapter 4, verses 16 through 19, Douay Rheims. Judge for the needy and fatherless, do justice to the humble and the poor. Psalm 81, verse 3, Douay Rheims.